Amy's eyes wandered from her book to look out the high windows of the living room. Nothing was there, just snowflakes lightly falling through the sky. Still, Amy shivered. She felt uneasy and a little scared all alone in the Morgans' big house. Little Isabel, the baby, was sound asleep in her nursery upstairs. Amy almost wished the baby would wake back up. At least there would be human sounds in the house to keep her company. She tried to keep her attention on the history book she was reading. Her teacher had warned the class that there might be a quiz on Monday morning, but it was difficult to concentrate, and Amy's eyes kept wandering off the page to look out into the dark night. She must have gone into a daze, staring out the window at the lightly falling snowflakes, because suddenly every muscle in her body jumped when she heard the sound of the front door opening. Amy listened to the click of the latch and then the slight creak of the heavy door as it moved. She even felt a cold draft move through the living room just as she heard the door shutting again. "Mrs. Morgan?" she called out in a frightened voice. "Mr. Morgan?" There was no answer. Only dead silence in the big house. Amy felt her heart begin to pound. Could it have been the wind that pushed the door open and closed again? Or was someone in the house? Amy shrank into a ball on the couch. She was suddenly too afraid to move. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps were moving across the hallway toward the staircase. "Who's there?" Amy called out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps slowly climbing the stairs to the second floor. Amy was so afraid now that she felt sick. She sat on the couch, listening to the footsteps climb up one step after another, higher and higher on the staircase. Then, through the panic clogging her mind, she remembered the baby, Isabel. Amy knew she couldn't just hide from the footsteps. She had to make sure the baby was all right. Standing up on trembling legs, Amy began to creep quietly across the living room toward the hallway. Just as she peeked around the corner of the doorway, she heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs and begin to move across the upstairs floor. Then they stopped. Amy froze where she stood. Terrible thoughts flew through her mind. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to go up and check on Isabel. She pushed the thought of the footsteps out of her mind and raced up the staircase as fast as she could climb the steps. Her heart was pounding, and her breath came in short gasps by the time she got to the top. Several lights were turned on in the hallway, and Amy searched every doorway and corner. But she saw no one there. Quickly, she dashed to the doorway of Isabel's room and flicked on the light. The room was empty except for the baby, who was cuddled in one corner of her crib, sound asleep. Amy strained her ears. There was no sound except for Isabel's light breathing. No footsteps. Not a hint of danger. For a second, Amy wondered if it had all been her imagination. Had she even heard the front door open at all? Had she really heard footsteps on the stairs? Maybe she had fallen asleep and it was all part of a bad dream. Amy looked at the baby one more time and then turned off the light. She tried to walk slowly down the hallway to the stairs, but halfway there she began to run, and she scrambled down the stairs so fast she almost fell. Finally, she ran into the living room and jumped back onto the sofa, curling her feet underneath her. She felt as though she just had a terrible nightmare, but now it was over. With trembling hands, Amy picked up her book again, but a second later, she heard the sound of the footsteps. They were coming back down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Amy wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry and tight. She listened to the footsteps get louder and louder as they came closer and closer to the hallway. In horror, she turned to look through the doorway to the staircase. The footsteps sounded as if they had just reached the bottom of the steps and were coming across the hallway toward her. But she could see nothing. Nothing at all. Amy fixed her eyes on that terrifying, empty space where the footsteps had stopped. Just at the doorway to the living room where she sat. For several agonizing moments, there was silence. Then the footsteps turned away and walked toward the front door. The door latch clicked, and once again, the solid wooden door swung open. Amy heard the heavy footsteps walk outside. Then the door shut, and the house was filled with silence. Slowly, Amy stood up and began to walk toward the front door. She walked over to the place at the doorway where the footsteps had waited. Then she went to the front door and slowly, carefully opened it. The snow was swirling down in big, thick flakes now. She looked down at the sidewalk. In the snow, she saw large, deep footprints walking away from the house.
I was never one for ghost stories. Growing up in a coal town like ours, you hear your share of tall tales, the kind of stories that old-timers spin with tobacco-stained teeth, hoping to scare the greenhorns into respecting the mines. But when you're the son of a miner, all that's just background noise to the rumble of coal carts and the grind of pickaxes. The Tommyknockers, in particular, were the stuff of legend. But legends are just that. Stories. At least, that's what I used to think. Myself, I've been a miner for over 20 years. My father and his father before him all worked the veins of coal below. It's a hard, honest living, and it puts food on the table. But there's the dangers, too. Every miner knows that. My old man used to say, "It's not if the mine'll get you, but when." He died in a cave-in when I was just 16. They never found his body. All they recovered was his helmet, lying like a tombstone on the rubble. From that day on, it was my helmet. Of course, even if you didn't get buried, the mines will find a way to get you. There's the cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear, and the air so dusty the pitman's plague is all but promised. Turns your lungs darker than dirt and steals the breath away from you, bit by bit, every day, until you have none left to take. But there's something about the mine that calls to you. It's in the blood, I guess. The mine becomes part of you, and you become part of it. The damp smell of the earth in those deep, dark tunnels reminds you where we all come from and what we all become again when our day is done. This story in particular happened on a Wednesday at the Maple Grove mines. A group of us, 12 or so, were finishing up the night shift just before dawn. Everyone just exhausted. Most of us, we kept our heads down and did our jobs, so I didn't think anything about how nobody was talking much. I was at my station when I started to hear it. At first I thought it was just the creaking timbers or someone kicking a rock or something. A faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on a door far away. But the knocking continued, almost like a heartbeat. Rhythmic, growing louder, more insistent. No matter how I tried, I couldn't pinpoint from which direction it was coming from. I asked the man working next to me if he heard it too. His name was Hank. He muttered something about the mine playing tricks on us and shrugged it off. But I wasn't so sure. As the night wore on, the knocking continued to grow louder, to the point where other miners started to notice something too. More and more wide-open eyes glanced around nervously in the dim light of our lamps. I could feel that everyone was on edge, just waiting for something to happen. Of course, without having any real reason not to, we just had to keep working. But something was coming, that much was clear. A mine has a million ways to kill you, and none of them are pretty. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped, and the whole cave fell silent. One by one, the men stopped working, looking around at each other with big eyes. And that's when the walls closed in. It happened so fast, in less than a second, the ceiling was on us. Somebody screamed. It may have been me, I don't know. And the world went black. When I came to, everything was still. The first thing I noticed was the cold. All I could smell was the earth, so I thought I was dead and buried. Then my heart started beating in my eardrums and I remembered where I was. I tried to swallow and couldn't. My throat was as dry as the dirt around me and I could taste blood. I tried to move, but my legs were pinned under a pile of rubble. I was trapped. I figured I should save my energy, so I held still a minute before trying to take a look around from where I was. I didn't see much, since the air was so thick with dust, and the light on my lamp was dim and flickering. I strained to hear any sounds at all, other movement, voices, even that curious knocking. Anything to tell me I wasn't alone. I tried to call out, but my voice was too weak. I couldn't get a deep enough breath to make a sound in the least. So I just started to think about how those were probably going to be my final moments, and I found myself jealous of the other men who must have died right away when the tunnels went in. I began to feel sleepy, and the throbbing in my head had calmed a bit. The thought of closing my eyes and drifting off for good didn't sound so bad. But then, I heard it again. At first it was so quiet I told myself that it was in my head. Then I knew, as the knocking got a little bit louder, that it was real, and it was coming from somewhere below me, far beneath the bowels of the earth. But I was stationed just off the shaft bottom. That's the lowest level in the mines, so there couldn't possibly be anyone below me. The sounds gave me a taste of hope, though, and that was enough for me. I was able to free one of my legs from the rubble, and then the other one, too. God damn it hurt like hell when I stood up. But I gritted my teeth and forced myself to limp ahead in the tunnel, over the jagged debris and twisted beams sticking out like broken bones. I thought for a second that I probably had a few of those myself, and I wasn't sure if I should keep moving and risk making anything worse. And I wondered about if there was a rescue team coming for us. Maybe it would be better to stay put, where they'd think to look for me. But the knocking continued, calling to me, urging me to follow. And in front of me, there was a gap in the rubble just big enough to squeeze through. I crawled through the gap, every movement sending pain through my battered body. On the other side, the tunnel sloped forward, and I could see my breath in the dim light of my headlamp. Which way was north or south or up or down, I couldn't have told you. I didn't know what to do other than keep on following that sound. Knock, knock, knock. I'm not sure how far I went or for how long. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a cave. My headlamp barely made a dent in the darkness, but when I came to a stop, I was certain I saw movement in the shadows. Knock, knock, knock. My first thought was that I'd come upon a nest of snakes, but as the knocking grew louder, I felt no choice but to follow. Deeper and deeper, darker and darker, and finally the shapes in the darkness came into view. Bent and twisted figures, with eyes glowing like dying embers. Their limbs were knotted together, like it shouldn't have been possible, and their faces, God, their faces. I knew it in my bones. These were the TOMMYKNOCKERS. Knock, knock, knock. Now I saw the chorus of fists pounding on the walls of the caverns, creating the never-ending knocking that echoed through the chambers. I was filled with terror. I wanted to go back, but I couldn't walk, let alone run. And there wasn't anything for me to head back toward anyway. So I just froze there, stuck to the spot like I was sprouting roots, as the Tommyknockers knocked. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. As it grew closer and closer, I could finally make out its face. His face. My father's. But his features were exaggerated and angular, and his skin gray and translucent. His crusty lips parted, and he opened his jaw. Further and further, impossibly down until his mouth was so ungodly wide his chin could rest on his stomach. And from his throat he released the most terrible, horrible, shrieking cry that slowly morphed into the sounds of my own name. He raised both arms in the air, and I was pulled forward by something I couldn't see, closer and closer to his gnarled fingers and his awful screaming face. The others closed in too, dragging their crooked feet forward until they swallowed me whole and buried me alive beneath their bodies. They found me the next morning, collapsed by a small entrance to the cave that was way on the other side of the mound that nobody had seemed to know was there before that. I was the first one they'd found, they said. I was lucky to be alive. But it had nothing to do with luck. I was alive because of the Tommyknockers, the spirits of the miners trapped below, that guided me to safety and shielded me from the debris. I can't say for sure if it was really my father down there, but I can say that the blow to my head would have killed me, if not for his helmet. Nobody accused me of lying, right out, about what I saw, but the authorities and the doctors, even my wife, they all said the same. Taking a blow like that to the head could have anyone seeing things that weren't there. The other men were never found. Not alive, not dead, nothing. And eventually they couldn't justify looking anymore, so they just sealed the whole cave off. Said it was too dangerous to keep open. But I knew what happened to them. My father and the men I had worked with. They're Tommyknockers now. And I can still hear the knocking sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it down below like a heartbeat. Knock, knock, knock. And one day, I won't be able to resist. There's just something about a mind that calls to you. After all, it's in the blood.
Tomas liked to walk with his grandfather in the high windswept hills that surrounded the small town where he lived. The hills were cut into odd shapes by the wind that had been blowing over them for more centuries than Tomas could imagine. His grandfather told Tomas about the ancient peoples who lived in the hills and were probably still buried there. Tomas listened to his grandfather's stories, but he didn't believe all of them, especially the ones about the dead people. Tomas wasn't the least bit superstitious, and his grandfather's stories were full of warnings about ghosts and evil spirits. One day, Tomas went out walking in the hills by himself. His grandfather wasn't feeling well because his legs were stiff and ached. Tomas promised to bring back a special plant that helped cure the aching. It grew wild in the fields where him and his grandfather often took their walks. Tomas set off from the town on a trail that wound up through the reddish-brown soil into the mountains. He decided to go visit the sheltered, cave-like hollows that the wind had carved into one of the hills many centuries ago. As he walked, he was surprised to find so many rocks fallen on the trail. He remembered hearing the wind last night when it woke him from a deep sleep. But the storm must have been much worse than he realized to have loosened so much dirt and rock from the mountain. Tomas walked on, keeping an eye out for the plant that he promised to bring his grandfather, but he remembered that it grew much higher on the mountain, close to where the hollows were. As he climbed up the trail, Tomas hugged his jacket tighter around his body. The wind was still blowing hard, and it cut through his clothes like a knife. Tomas started to run to stay warm. Soon he came to an overlook and stopped to rest. Below him in the valley, Tomas saw his town. It looked so small and unimportant from where he stood. And suddenly, Tomas felt small and unimportant too, all alone on the mountain. He shivered and thought about turning around and running back home. But he remembered the plant that he'd promised to get his grandfather and started back up the mountain trail. A short time later, Tomas came to the place where another small trail led off toward the hollowed-out caves in the side of the mountain. He could see that the windstorm had been even stronger here. Loose soil and rock were blown into piles where they'd never been before. Finally, Tomas reached the base of one of the hollows, like a dark mouth carved into the side of the mountain. He began to climb up a steep rise to its entrance, but halfway up, he came to a sudden stop. Right in front of him on the trail was a white object. It was so white that it seemed to be shining in the sun. Tomas stared at it in disbelief. He'd climbed this rise many times with his grandfather, but he'd never seen this skull before. Tomas stepped up to the skull and bent down on his knees to study it. The skull lay looking back at him with its empty eyes and grinning teeth. Tomas reached down to pick it up, and just as he touched the hard, smooth bone, he remembered his grandfather's words. "Never disturb the rest of the dead." For a moment, Tomas almost dropped the skull. He could still hear the warning note in his grandfather's voice. But now the skull was in his hands, and he wanted to keep it. He could hide it on the bottom shelf of his bedroom closet, and when his friends came over, he could show it to them. No one else he knew had a human skull. The skull grinned up at him as Tomas carried it away from the mountain. He knew that the rest of the skeleton had to be buried somewhere nearby, and the grave had been disturbed by the storm the night before. But now the skull was his, and after all, whomever it belonged to was long, long dead. When Tomas came near his house, he pushed the skull under his jacket and hurried into his room to hide it. Then he came out to talk to his grandfather, who sat rocking in a chair by the big living room window. The moment he met his grandfather's eyes, he remembered the plant he had promised to bring. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I forgot the plant, but I'll go back and get it if you want," Tomas stuttered, suddenly feeling as though everything he'd done was wrong. His grandfather told him it was too late for the day, but maybe tomorrow he could go back for the plant. Tomas agreed and then went back to his room. He looked again at the skull, grinning out at him from its hiding place. Suddenly, Tomas wished he had never brought it home. He threw a sweater over top of it and shut the closet door. That night, the wind began to howl again. Tomas went to bed early, after his parents had gone out and his grandfather started telling stories again. Tomas did not want to hear the stories, so he lied and said he didn't feel well. But when he laid down in bed, it didn't seem to be a lie anymore. He didn't feel well. His body was shivery and his stomach ached, and the thought of the skull in the closet filled his mind with uneasy dread. Finally, he couldn't stand to just lie in the dark anymore and think about that skull. He got up, turned on the lights, and opened his closet door. He picked up the sweater he'd thrown over it and saw the skull sitting there, just where he left it, still grinning at him, but now the grin seemed to have an evil edge to it. Tomas slammed the closet door and ran back to his bed, flicking off the light and covering his head with the blanket. After tossing and turning for more than an hour, he fell asleep at last. Tomas wasn't sure what woke him hours later in the middle of the night. Maybe it was the wind still howling outside, or maybe it was the aching feeling in his stomach. But whatever it was made him sit straight up in his bed. He sat there, feeling a shiver travel through his whole body from head to toe. Then he noticed the strange smell in the room, the smell of something old and dead. And as he sat there in the dark, shaking, Tomas heard a strange sound. It was the sound of things that were smooth and hard, clicking against each other. With trembling hands, Tomas reached over and turned on his light. Standing at the end of his bed was a headless skeleton, its long, bony arms reaching out, searching for something. Then, from inside his closet, Tomas heard a weird voice.
"Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones."
Tomas shrank down in the bed. He watched as the white skeleton moved around his room, grasping out with bony fingers. The legs stalked over to where he lay, and the cold, bony fingers touched his feet. And still from the closet came the voice.
"Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones."
Then the bony fingers of the skeleton moved up to Tomas's head and felt his eyes and nose and lips. Fear choked Tomas's voice as he lay there, unable to scream, waiting for the skeleton to take its revenge. But the voice from the closet called out even louder.
"Give me back my bones."
Suddenly, Tomas jumped from the bed and ran to the closet. He opened the door and reached down to pick up the cold white skull. Its hollow sockets looked up at him, and its grinning teeth began to move.
"Give me back my bones."
With shaking hands, he carried the skull to the skeleton and placed it on top of its neck. The skull turned its face to him and grinned once more. Then the skeleton walked out of Tomas's room. The next morning, Tomas woke with an awful headache. He rubbed his eyes in the morning sun and suddenly remembered the terrible dream he'd had. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the closet, and he searched and searched. But the grinning skull was gone.
Jack and Emily, a brother and sister, both in their early 20s, were on their way to visit their grandmother. It was supposed to be a simple trip, an afternoon drive through the countryside, but Jack had insisted on taking a shortcut through the woods. Emily, always the more cautious of the two, reluctantly agreed. The road soon turned narrow and winding, flanked by dense trees that twisted and stretched closer and closer. The sun vanished behind the crooked branches above, and with it any sense of direction. The siblings drove on in uneasy silence, neither one willing to admit just how anxious they felt. "Jack, I think we're lost," Emily eventually said, her voice trembling.
The road only goes one way or the other,
Jack replied with annoyance.
Time's just passing slowly because it all looks the same.
"I guess," Emily replied softly.
Don't worry, we'll find our way,
Jack replied, though he didn't sound convinced. Hours passed as their car continued on through a maze of trees. The plans to visit their grandmother now seemed like a vague memory, and the fuel gauge was getting dangerously close to empty. Just as panic began to set in, they spotted a dim light through the fog. As they got closer, they could make out the bold neon letters of a quaint diner sign. "Hot to go," it read. "Home-cooked meals fast." Beside the diner entrance was a pair of gas pumps below a no self-serve sign. The structure looked completely out of place, but desperation led them to the door, and as they entered, a bell tinkled softly. The interior was inviting, filled with the comforting, nostalgic smells of savory meats, warm, fresh bread, and sugary sweets. An old woman stood behind the counter, her eyes twinkling with that strange familiarity that provides instant relief.
"Welcome, dears,"
She said with a kind smile.
"You must be hungry."
Her voice was soothing like a lullaby. Jack and Emily nodded, their stomachs rumbling. The woman who introduced herself as Greta led them to a booth and handed them menus.
"I'll fix a couple suppers to go, but won't you join me for a bite before I fill your tank?"
She asked.
"Fuel up while you fuel up." I just finished a pot of my most famous stew. It's the house special.
The siblings, famished and tired, agreed. They watched as the woman stepped behind the counter where a massive vat of stew boiled over a small fire. With a cheerful smile, Greta ladled a large helping for each of the siblings and returned to the table in a cloud of steam. The aroma was intoxicating, a mix of fragrant spices that made their mouths water. Chopped vegetables and heavy chunks of meat danced in the thick and bubbling red broth. Jack took the first bite and couldn't help but groan with pleasure.
"Holy cow,"
he said, shoveling more into his mouth.
"this is amazing."
Emily followed suit and nearly danced in her seat as the flavors exploded across her tongue. Somehow sweet, savory, and spicy all at once, but not overwhelming. Neither of them normally cared for spicy foods, but Greta's stew was intoxicating. They ate ravenously, their hunger growing with each bite. The more they ate, the more they wanted. The broth coated their mouths, lubricating their throats, a greasy, slick sensation that left them both craving and repulsed. They couldn't stop, their hands mechanically scooping chunks of tender meat and soft vegetables and tearing into the bread, soaking it in the broth to make swallowing easier. Before long, their limbs felt heavy. Their heads began to swim. The diner seemed to shift and pulse around them, like a hidden heartbeat in the walls. Colors blurred and sharpened around them, the lights coming in and out of focus, like the air above was filled with shooting stars. Jack's tongue felt almost too thick to speak.
"I don't feel so good."
He slurred. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. But they couldn't stop. They continued painfully shoveling spoonfuls of stew into their mouths as Greta appeared with a fresh pot and loaf of bread. They ate and ate, chewing and swallowing, gulping and nearly choking. And with every bite, they felt more and more energy draining from their bodies. When Greta returned with yet another helping for each of them, the siblings noticed that the old woman was looking much more youthful now. Her wrinkles had been smoothed away, and the color of her hair emboldened. Even the diner itself seemed to be transforming around them into something newer, cleaner. Jack and Emily exchanged a dazed glance as creeping horror settled in. And Emily tried her best to push the bowl away. But it was like the spoon was glued to her hand. Jack tried to stand, but his butt wouldn't budge from the bench below.
"Oh, you can't leave yet, my dears.
Greta grinned widely, her eyes sparkling like the lights around her.
You haven't finished your supper.
It seemed impossible. But as the siblings consumed the stew consumed the siblings, stealing away their youth with every slurp and swallow. Greta was even younger looking now, barely older than the pair of siblings themselves. But now, Jack and Emily looked much older than they were, with gaunt, leathering skin and sunken eyes. The lights stopped glittering, and the diner's walls stopped pulsing as the edges of the room began to darken and swirl. To Emily's horror, Jack face-planted into his soup, the air bubbles rising to the top of the bowl, coating his bangs with broth. Her brother twitched in his seat, but he couldn't raise his head from the bowl. He was too weak. His entire body was lead, unable to support the heavy boulder that was now his head. In a matter of seconds, he would drown. Using every ounce of energy she had, Emily threw herself forward, freeing Jack from certain death and knocking both bowls to the floor where the stew splashed everywhere. The broth sizzled and burned through the linoleum like acid, emitting a horrible stench of decay. And Greta screamed as if her own body was being burned.
You ungrateful brats.
She hissed, advancing on them. As her face twisted in fury, the mask of youth came loose and the old hag beneath was revealed once again, her bony hands stretched and twisted into wicked claws, and she lunged for them with shocking speed. Jack and Emily were slowly regaining their energy, and Jack finally broke free from the weight that had held him down. He grabbed Emily's hand, helping her to her feet, and they stumbled together like drunks towards the door as their muscles fought desperately to awake. But with every step they took, the door moved further and further away. Greta's wicked cackling echoed through the never-ending diner as the rotten stench of stew saturated Jack and Emily's nostrils. I can't go any further, Emily cried, falling to her knees. I'm sorry, Jack. Jack knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her.
We have to try, Em. We can't give up.
With a wave of Greta's hand, Jack was flung backwards, thrown through the air across the room and crashing painfully into a table. Its legs gave way, and the wooden tabletop smashed into the floor below him, sending splinters across the floor. Jack was momentarily stunned by the onslaught of excruciating pain. He tried to breathe, but his lungs pulled no air. Greta's face filled with devilish joy as she watched the boy struggle to find his breath, twitching atop the remnants of the table.
You make the most delectable dessert,
she hissed. But Emily appeared right behind the woman, swinging a chair with all of her might and shattering it against Greta's back, who shrieked in agony, whipping around.
You little bitch!
She bellowed. Utterly enraged, Greta closed in on Emily, who had accidentally backed herself into a corner. Jack was still struggling to pull himself up from the floor. She had to think of something. Stay away! Emily cried, pulling the necklace from beneath her shirt. It was her grandmother's pendant, a small, pure silver charm that supposedly provided luck and protection, and though she didn't really believe in that stuff, she always felt better when she wore it. Greta hissed like a snake, recoiling. Behind her, Jack slowly and silently crawled towards the counter. You're powerless against the symbol of love and protection, Emily cried. But Greta burst into a fit of cackling laughter.
You think I give two shits about your dime store trinket?
She got closer and closer. her crooked, sharp nails extended for Emily's face. Just in time, Jack burst from behind the counter, smashing a pair of pots and pans into the old woman's temples before dropping them with a clattering bang to the floor. The wicked witch was stunned and dizzy, and Jack used the moment to snatch the sack of salt from his back pocket, throwing it forth into the woman's eyes and painfully blinding her. Emily ran from the corner as Greta fell backwards to the floor, screaming in agony and wiping blindly through the air in all directions. Emily smashed another chair against the woman as Jack shoved her across the floor towards the counter. Greta continued to flail around and scream in agony, her long nails lacerating the skin around her eyes as she desperately tried to shake the salt from them.
The dime store trinket may not have stopped you,
Jack said.
but our grandmother's the one that taught us that salt repels evil.
With a battle cry that shook the walls of the diner, the witch took a final lunge in Jack's direction. He smashed his body into hers, colliding painfully but knocking her closer to the kitchen, closer to the bubbling cauldron. The blinded woman thrashed and flailed, and with one final blow, she lost her balance, tumbling backwards into the vat with a sizzling splash. Where the stew touched her skin, the flesh melted away, and her painful screams echoed through the entire forest.
What have you done?
She cried.
What have you done?
As she boiled before them, Jack and Emily saw pulsating glimpses of the many faces below, the beautiful young woman and the horrible wicked witch, with so many in between. The diner began to crumble, and Jack and Emily made a final dash for the door. This time, it stayed put, bursting open with the tinkling of the bell as the cold night air embraced them. Just as they made it to safety, the diner collapsed in on itself. Greta's screams of agony echoed above the trees. Jack and Emily kept running until they reached the car haphazardly parked at the edge of the lot. Breathing heavily, they climbed inside. Jack fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. Strangely, the fuel gauge now rested just above half empty, and the fog began to lift as they pulled away. The siblings drove in silence, shaken by the horror they had faced. They didn't know what to do other than continue on to their grandmother's house, where they found the kindly old woman waiting up for them with open arms. The pair didn't want to worry her, though, at least not so late at night, so they explained away their extended delay as a mistaken wrong turn that got them lost.
You rest your weary heads and we'll talk more in the morning,
Their grandmother said. Sounds perfect.
We can catch up over coffee on the porch or have a picnic by the pond.
She was so excited to see her grandchildren, and they were happier to see her than she could possibly know.
You two just think about what you'd like to eat,
She said.
and I'll make us something hot to go.
Jack and Emily looked at each other, terror-struck by the familiar phrase. Then Emily shook the fear off and smiled back at her grandmother. As long as there's not any stew.
Susan was my best friend, but I try never to think about her. It's only on certain nights, when I'm all alone in my room, that I remember. It was during Christmas vacation last year when Susan asked me to stay at her house overnight. She lived in a big, gloomy house set way back from the road, and she didn't want to be alone there at night. Her parents had gone to visit some friends and wouldn't be back until the next afternoon. Susan said we could have a really good time without her parents around. And we did. At about midnight, we decided to get dressed for bed. Susan was given this velvet nightrobe for Christmas that had a thick, furry collar. It was blood red velvet, and she looked like someone from a Dracula movie in it. We had been watching television in the living room, but then we turned it off. We hadn't noticed it before, but now the downstairs seemed too big, almost sinister. We started to go upstairs. Then, all of a sudden, we both ran up the steps to Susan's room as if something was coming up from behind us. After we closed the door, we laughed at ourselves, but neither one of us wanted to leave the room again. We sat down and started to talk, and that's when we first heard the noise. It sounded like somebody sharpening a knife on an old emery stone. We stopped talking and looked at each other, feeling really scared inside. There was just a thick silence in the room. Suddenly, Susan started to laugh. She said she had heard a sound like that in the house before. She said it was probably the shutters or something. That made me feel better, and we went back to talking. But then we heard it again. The sound made my teeth vibrate as if somebody's fingernails were scratching on a chalkboard. But this sound was much worse. It shrieked up from the dark, lonely rooms below us. Susan got a wild look in her eyes, as if something horrible had come into her head. Before I could catch her, she ran out of the room, slamming the door shut and flicking off the light switch. I heard her footsteps as she ran down the first flight of stairs, and then stop. I sat in the dark, sick with fright. I called out Susan's name, but my voice was answered by hushed silence. I didn't want to stay in the dark room alone, but even more, I didn't want to go out into that other darkness. Then I heard it again, that disgusting sound. Then I heard Susan's footsteps, moving down the next and final flight of stairs. She went more slowly, as if she really didn't want to. I heard her reach the bottom. I waited in the room, wondering what Susan was doing. I told myself she must be all right. The noise had stopped right after I heard her reach the bottom of the stairs. She had probably just fixed the shutter. Maybe she had just acted strangely to scare me. Maybe she was sitting on the steps now, laughing at me. I got up and started toward the door to turn the light on, but a feeling of fear swept over me that held me back like a hand against my throat. I decided I would wait where I was for Susan to return. I would wait there until her parents returned, if necessary. Nothing could make me leave my darkness for that darker unknown outside the room. Time passed. My ears strained for a sound and my nerves tingled at imagined shadows. Then I heard a slow, shuffling noise on the bottom step. Was it Susan? It had to be. Yet the footsteps seemed too heavy, too deliberate. My heart began to pound, and for a moment I lost control of my mind. It flew to the most horrible corners of my imagination, and I shook with terror. Then, suddenly, I knew what I would do. Susan's new nightrobe with the furry collar. I would wait for the door to open, and then I would reach out and touch the person's neck. If I felt the furry collar, I would know it was Susan, and I would get her back for scaring me like this. And if I didn't feel the furry collar, then there was nothing I could do. The shuffling footsteps had reached the second flight of stairs. I forced my own feet to take the steps to get near the door of the room. I felt the skin crawling on my back as the footsteps reached the top stair and moved down the hallway. I braced myself. The door creaked slightly as it swung open. I reached out my arms and hoped. My fingers closed around the thick fur of Susan's collar, and my body drained with relief. I moved my hands up to touch Susan's face. I was so happy I no longer even cared to scare her. But as my fingers moved up from the furry collar, there was nothing there. Only the bloody stump where Susan's head used to be.
I never told you how I once went over the hills and found the dead valley, did I? My old friend Olaf asked. Well, this is the way it happened. He was a curiously headstrong fellow, one who often joined me in the winter evenings to play chess together, and after some close, fierce battle had been fought to the finish, usually with my own defeat, we'd fill our glasses and pipes once again, and Olaf would share stories of his faraway, half-remembered days from before he went to sea. The tales grew stranger and more incredible as the fires fell into themselves and the nights deepened. But nevertheless, I fully believed them to be true. One of them made a strong impression on me, so I recall it here, only regretting that I cannot reproduce his delicate accent, which to me increased the fascination of the tale. Yet, as best I can remember it, here it is. I must have been about 12 years old, and my friend Nils, whose father's estate joined ours, was a few months younger. We were inseparable at the time, and whatever we did together. Once a week, it was market day, and Nils and I went always there to see the strange sights that the market gathered from all the surrounding country. One day we quite lost our hearts, for an old man had brought a little dog to sell from far away in Hallsberg. The round, woolly puppy was so funny that we sat on the ground and laughed at him, and he came and played with us in such a jolly way that we felt there was only one really desirable thing in life, and it was this little dog. But we had not even half the money to buy him, so we begged the old man not to sell him before the next market day, promising we'd bring the money for him then. He gave us his word, and we ran home very fast and implored our mothers to give us money for the little dog. We got the money, but we could not wait for the next market day. Suppose the puppy should be sold? The thought frightened us so that we begged and implored that we might be allowed to go over the hills to where the old man lived and get the little dog ourselves. And at last, they told us we could go. By starting early in the morning, we should reach Hallsberg by 3 o'clock, and it was arranged that we would stay there that night with Nils's aunt, leaving by noon the next day. Soon after sunrise, we were on our way, after receiving detailed instructions as to just what we should do in all possible and impossible circumstances, and promised that we should start for home the next day so that we'd get safely home before nightfall. We started off with our rifles, full of the sense of our own great importance. Yet the journey was simple enough, along a good road, across the big hills we knew so well. There was a long valley, from which rose the low mountains, and we had to cross this, then follow the road along the side of the hills for 3 or 4 miles, before a narrow path branched off to the left, leading up through the pass. Nothing of interest occurred on the way over, and we reached the man's home in due time, where we found to our inexpressible joy that the little dog was not sold. So we secured him and went to the house of Nils's aunt to spend the night. Why we did not leave early on the following day, I can't quite remember. At all events, we did not get fairly started for home until afternoon, and as we found ourselves at last pushing up the side of the mountain, with the sun dangerously near the horizon, I think we were a little scared of the punishment that awaited us when we got home at midnight. We hurried as fast as possible up the mountainside, while the blue dusk closed in about us, and the light died in the purple sky. At first, we had talked hilariously as the little dog leaped ahead of us with the utmost joy. Soon, however, a curious oppression came on us. We did not speak or laugh or even whistle, and the dog fell behind, following us with hesitation in every muscle. We had passed through the foothills and the low spurs of the mountains when life seemed to go out of everything, leaving the world dead. So suddenly silent the forest became, so stagnant the air. Instinctively, we halted to listen. Perfect silence, unbroken even by the turn of a leaf, the movement of a twig, the note of night bird or insect. I could hear the blood beat through my veins, and the crushing of the grass under our feet as we advanced with hesitating steps that sounded like the falling of trees. This was silence in the absolute, and it crushed the mind while it intensified the senses, bringing down the awful weight of inextinguishable fear. And the air was stagnant, dead. The atmosphere seemed to lie upon us like the weight of the sea on a diver who ventured too far into its depths. Nils and I stared towards each other in abject terror, listening to our quick, heavy breathing. And the poor little dog we were leading justified our terror. The black oppression seemed to crush him even as it did us. He lay close on the ground, moaning feebly and dragging himself painfully and slowly closer to Nils's feet. Then, as we stood quaking on the bounds of madness, came a sound so awful, so ghastly, so horrible, that it seemed to rouse us from the dead spell that was on us. In the depth of silence came a cry, beginning as a low, sorrowful moan, rising to a terrible yell, culminating in a shrieking that seemed to tear the world itself asunder. In the pale light of the high stars, Nils was the embodiment of all possible human fear, quaking with his jaw fallen, his tongue out, his eyes protruding like those of a hanged man. Without a word we fled, the panic of fear giving us strength, and together, the little dog caught close in Nils's arms, we sped down the side of the cursed mountains. Anywhere, we had but one impulse, to get away from that place. So under the black trees, we leaped down the mountainside, regardless of path or landmark, straight through the tangled underbrush, across mountain streams and boggy marshes. Our only course was downward. How long we ran, I have no idea. But eventually the forest fell behind, and we found ourselves exhausted on the dry, short grass among the foothills, panting like tired dogs. It was lighter here in the open, and we looked around to see where we were and find the path that would lead us home. We looked in vain for a familiar sign. Behind us rose the great wall of black forest on the flank of the mountain. Before us lay the undulating mounds of low foothills, unbroken by trees or rocks. And beyond, only the fall of black sky bright with white stars that turned its velvet depth to a glowing gray. As I remember, we did not speak to each other once. The terror was too heavy on us for that. But by and by we rose simultaneously and started out across the hills. Still the same silence, the same dead, motionless air that was at once sultry and chilling. A heavy heat struck through with an icy chill that felt like the burning of frozen steel. Still carrying the helpless dog, Nils pressed on through the hills and I followed close behind. At last, in front of us, rose a slope of moor. We climbed it wearily, reached the top, and found ourselves gazing down into a great, smooth valley, filled halfway to the brim with... what? As far as the eye could see stretched a sea of ashy white, motionless like water and faintly phosphorescent. If it were possible, I think that sea of velvet fog struck even greater terror into my soul than the deadly cry. It was so ominous, so impossible, so utterly unreal, so phantasmal. A dead ocean lamenting under the luminous stars. But there was no other way home, and our abject fear was shattered by the mad desire to get back. So we started down the slope to the sea of milky mist. Where the sharp and distinct stems of rough grass ceased, I put one foot into the ghostly fog. A chill as of death itself struck through me, stopping my heart, and I threw myself backward on the slope. At that instant came again the shrieking cry, closer and closer, right in our ears, in our very selves. And I saw the cold mist lift like a waterspout toward the sky, dimming the stars. This was enough. We turned and fled along the shore of the white sea that clashed behind us, rising slowly and steadily, driving us higher and higher up the foothills. It was a race for our lives, that we knew. How we kept going I cannot understand, but we did, and at last we staggered up the end of the valley, and I saw the white sea fall behind us. And the last thing I remember was hearing Nils say, "The dog was dead." It was 3 weeks later, as I remember, that I awoke in my own room and found my mother sitting beside the bed. I could not think at first, but as I slowly grew strong again, vague flashes of recollection began to come to me, and little by little, the whole sequence of events of that awful night in the Dead Valley came back. I was told that 3 weeks before, I had been found in my own bed, raging sick, and that my illness grew fast into brain fever. I tried to speak of the dreadful things that had happened to us, but no one looked at them, save as the hauntings of delirium. My mother told me that Nils had also been ill with a strange fever, but was now quite well again. Soon he visited, and, when we were alone, I began to speak to him of the night on the mountain. I shall never forget the shock that struck me down when the boy denied everything. Denied hearing the horrible cry, or seeing the valley, or feeling the deadly chill of the ghostly fog. He denied having gone with me at all. Nothing would shake him, and in spite of myself, I was forced to admit that my weakened brain was in turmoil. Was it all but hysteria? Or had the horrors of the Dead Valley blotted Nils's mind into blankness? I said nothing more, but waited, with a growing determination that, once well again, I would find that valley if it really existed. It was some weeks before I was really well enough to go, but finally, late in September, I chose a bright, warm, still day, the last smile of the dying summer, and started early in the morning along the path that led to Hallsberg. I was sure I knew where the trail struck off to the right, down which we had come from the Valley of Dead Water, for a great tree grew by the path at the point where, with a sense of salvation, we had found the home road. I think the bright sunlight and clear air worked as a tonic, and by the time I came to the foot of the great pine, even I had lost faith in the vision that haunted me. Nevertheless, I turned sharply to the right, at the base of the tree, into a narrow path that led through a dense thicket. As I did so, I tripped over something. Flies swarmed around me, singing in my ears, and a terrible stench filled my nostrils. Looking down, I saw a pile of small bones poking through a matted fleece, all that was left of the poor little dog we had bought. Then I knew it was all true, and my courage went out with a puff. Pride urged me on, however, and I pressed into the thicket that barred my way. The path was hardly visible, for the bushes above grew thick and hardly penetrable. The land rose slowly, and the rising grew clearer, until at last I came out on a great slope of hill, unbroken by trees or shrubs, most like the rise of land that gave way to the Dead Valley and icy fog. I looked at the sun. It was bright and clear, and all around insects were humming in the autumn air, and birds were darting to and fro. Surely there was no danger, not until nightfall at least. So I began to whistle, and with a rush mounted the last crest of Brown Hill. There lay the Dead Valley. On all sides, the grass crept over the brink of the encircling hills, dusty green on the crests, then fading into ashy brown and forming a thin ring of deadly white, running in a long line around the slope. And then, nothing. Bare, brown, hard, glittering earth, dead and barren. Not a tuft of grass, not a stick of brushwood, not even a stone, but only the vast expanse of beaten clay. In the midst of the basin, perhaps a mile and a half away, the level expanse was broken by a great dead tree, rising leafless and gaunt into the air. Without a moment's hesitation, I started down into the valley. Every particle of fear seemed to have left me, and even the valley itself did not look so very terrifying. I was driven by overwhelming curiosity, and there seemed to be but one thing in the world to do: to get to that tree. As I trudged over the hard earth, I noticed that the voices of the birds and insects had died away. No bee or butterfly hovered through the air. No insects leaped or crept over the dull earth. The very air itself was stagnant. As I drew near the skeleton tree, I noticed the glint of sunlight on a kind of white mound around its roots. All around the barkless trunk was heaped a wilderness of little bones. Tiny skulls of rodents and birds, thousands of them, rising about the dead tree and streaming off for several yards in all directions, until the dreadful pile ended in isolated skulls and scattered skeletons. Here and there a larger bone appeared, the thigh of a sheep, the hoofs of a horse, and to one side, grinning slowly, a human skull. I stood quite still, staring with all my eyes, when suddenly the dense silence was broken by a faint, forlorn screeching high over my head. A great falcon suddenly sailed downward over the tree, violently landing among the bleaching bones. Motionless. Struck with terror, I rushed for home, my brain whirling. I ran steadily on and on, a strange numbness growing in me. At last, I glanced up. Where was the rise of hill? I looked around wildly. Close before me was the dead tree with its pile of bones. I had circled it round and round, and the green grasses sloping up from the valley were still 1.5 miles away. The sun was sinking, red and dull, towards the line of hills. In the east, the dark was growing fast. My feet seemed clogged, as in a nightmare. I could hardly drag them over the barren earth. And then I felt the slow chill creeping through me. I looked down. A thin mist was rising out of the earth, collecting in little pools that grew ever larger until they joined here and there, their currents swirling slowly like thin blue smoke. When it was dark, I would hear that shriek again. And then I would die. I knew that. And with every remaining atom of will, I staggered through the writhing mist that crept clammily around my ankles, slowing my steps toward the copper west. And as I fought my way off from the tree, the silence pursued me. The air choked my breath. The fog caught at my feet like hellish hands, and the horror grew until at last I was certain my time had come. But I won, though not a moment too soon. As I crawled on my hands and knees up the slope, I heard, far away and high in the air, the cry that already had almost bereft me of reason. It was faint and vague, but unmistakable in its horrible intensity. I glanced behind. The sky was gold under the setting sun, but below was the ashy gray of death. I stood for a moment on the brink of this sea of hell, and then followed the dense and pallid fog heaving up and over the brown slope. The sunset opened before me, and as I crawled home, weak and tired, the night closed behind on the dead valley.